Well, good morning and welcome to this special coverage on the Labor Day Feat 2024, an occasion usually set aside to highlight the rights of workers and to acknowledge their contributions to society. And of course, in line with the tradition, the Central Organization of Trade Unions Kenya is hosting the festivities taking place at Uhuru Gardens in Lang'ata here in Nairobi, with President William Ruto expected to officiate that event. Of course, we'll be listening to hear more on crucial national issues impacting our workforce, from the ongoing debate on the wage bill to discussions around minimum wage, taxation, and the pressing concern of labor migration. We have our teams on the ground, Lofty Matambo and Frida Mwaka, as well as Brian George, who will be giving us more details from the ground at Uhuru Gardens, and of course what we expect to hear and some of the issues that will be coming out from the speeches there. And of course we'll also be having a conversation here in studio, just trying to understand some of the main aspects of surrounding the issues that affect the workforce here in the country. I do have James Wanjeri, who's a commercial employment and labor lawyer. Very good morning. Good to see you.
Yes, same here.
We also have Kidi Mwaga. He calls himself a connoisseur of public policy, business and management consultant. He's a political strategist and also a communication expert. Thank you so much, Kidi, for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Good to see you, and great to know that you've arrived here safely. You know, we know that things are not looking so good for Kenyans in several parts of the country. We know about the number of people who've died as a result of the floods. The torrential rains are really coming in hard. But, you know, this is just one of the issues that are affecting, you know, the labor force in the country. But, of course, there are many other things to also look at. We're looking at the issue of the economic slowdown. This is dipping the new jobs in the country. Food prices are up. We're facing these devastating floods. And worker salaries are not really keeping pace with, you know, the price of basic commodities in the country. Just first of all, do you think Kenyan workers have anything to celebrate today? Let me begin with you, James.
Well, I think it's true, as you've said. We've had, maybe in the past 5 years, we've had some really major changes happening. Of course, we had the pandemic coming, and the effect of that was we saw a lot of people losing their jobs. And quickly followed by that, we had the economic issues we've gone through as a country. I think those with a job have a reason to celebrate because we have seen many people lose their jobs. Of course, it could be better. It could be better. But yes, just to answer your question directly, those who have a job, maybe they have a reason to celebrate just because of that fact. Yeah.
Right. Hidi, your thoughts?
Thank you, Zainab. It's good being back on NTV. You know, NTV is home.
Right.
Yes. So in regards to the Labor Day celebrations today, I think the Kenyan workers are a bit apprehensive at this very moment. Apprehensive because their salaries are not matching with the circumstances they find themselves in regards to the cost of living, in regards to the general work environment that they find themselves in today. In part because of what my brother said, COVID-19, the floods that are ongoing, the levies that government has had to, you know, put in place in the last 1 year.
Right.
All these have served to create apprehension in the minds and hearts of many Kenyan workers. But I think that it can only get better. So I think that the Kenyan workers today must look at the brighter side of life, that out of all this, it can only get better for all of us. Thank you. Yes.
But then also remember, this falls on the back of doctors who are on strike right now.
Yes.
You have about 7,000 doctors who are employees of the government who are on strike because of what they term as, at the crux of the matter, is the 2017 collective bargaining agreement, which they signed with the government. So then this leaves many Kenyans as well at the very hands, you know, at the mercy of, you know, poor infrastructure and understaffed hospitals as well. So then what does this speak of? Let me begin with you, James, of, you know, the state of the workforce looking at the healthcare sector, for instance, at this point?
Well, I think the challenge we're having in the health sector is regrettable, really. I think it has gone on for too long. I think we are beyond 30 days now.
Yeah.
The feeling among people was that by now this would have been resolved. But you also realize that the reason we are where we are today is because successively we have had people who have lacked the courage to make the decisions that are necessary, both from a labor point of view and even from a resource point of view. So that now we are at a standstill because people are taking hardline positions. And I think even as you've seen what the court has done, when the court has been invited to declare this strike illegal, what the court has said instead is, go to the negotiating table and try and resolve this. So the issue with our health sector, and I know this has been spoken about severally, we have a challenge that has been decades in the making. But what has happened is that every time a generation has been given an opportunity to deal with it, they've deferred it to the next generation. So now you have a CBA that was signed in 2017 by government, and now government wants to back out of that CBA, and they're claiming they don't have the resources for it. But on the other hand, you have doctors. These are people who go to school for 6-7 years. You know, you have doctor interns who cannot be posted. And without being posted, your medical degree is useless because then you cannot get into the workforce. So it's a lot of frustration, and what is lacking really is courage. And
is it courage or is it goodwill?
I think both. I would say both. There's lack of goodwill, of course, on part of the government because there is already a CBA. And I think the law is very clear. Once you enter into a CBA, then you are held to the terms of that CBA. And that CBA was actually negotiated and discussed, and it was clearly an agreement. So there's that lack of goodwill. But also, on the part of lack of courage, what I mean by this is that I think there are some decisions that government can actually take, and there are some things that government can do to ensure that this impasse is settled once and for all. But what we are seeing is a lot of burden shifting. Even within the government today, you find that different agencies are shifting this burden to each other. And no one really wants to take this head on and, you know, deal with it once and for all. It's unconscionable really for a doctor to be told that we would have paid you 160,000, but now we have to slash that to 70,000. I mean, even just get into the frame of that person's mind. What type of service are they going to give? We have some of these doctors are working almost 3-day shifts non-stop. So yes, lack of goodwill, but also a lack of courage. I think we need some courageous people to make a decision because this has gone on for too long. Now we have a crisis for the floods. Where are these people being taken? There are no doctors in hospitals. So it's just getting worse and worse. The stone is rolling. And the more it rolls, the bigger it gets. And I'm afraid to see where it goes if we just let it go as it is. Yeah.
And Kidi, your thoughts? Because look, collective bargaining agreements essentially are realized under unlimited labor rights enshrined, and you can correct me, this Article 41 of the Constitution and the Employment and Labor Laws of Kenya. They certainly enjoy this right under the Constitution. So then it falls on the feet of the government, the state, right?
Zainab, first, you realize that one mistake that has happened in this country is that the political class have always attempted to condemn or to ostracize industrial relations whenever they take place, forgetting that industrial relations are anchored and protected in the law and in the Constitution, as you rightly point out at Article 41. But then again, remember, in regards to the doctor's question, we got here because of what I would call weak social trust. Because remember, I want us to look at the circumstances under which the CBA 2017 was signed. Remember, it was signed a month to the elections. But then, before getting there, the first 5 years before that CBA was signed was an era marked with a lot of what I would call public spending mismanagement. What things like public spending mismanagement does to a country generally is that it weakens the social trust. And so when the doctors were going to the negotiating table in 2017, they were going to that negotiating table knowing that they were dealing with a government that was not very responsible. As a result, we ended up with the CBA as it is. Then what the government did is that it did not honor the CBA. Instead, it engaged in political ingenuity that was going to render the implementation of that CBA, and I am using that word very deliberately, political ingenuity that was rendering implementation of this CBA almost untenable. Remember, this was a time when we got into a bit of political, rapprochement. Then quickly, the leadership of the KMPDU then was co-opted into certain governmental agencies. And then therefore, for the next 5 years, doctors were unable to, find someone to articulate these issues properly. So today, remember, every agreement enter into in government with government has got no lapse period. It is something that can be effected even 20 years later. So right now, doctors have got a right to ask for this CBA to be honored. Again, another tragedy is that the economic situation we find ourselves in, I think on part of government, makes it a little bit difficult to honor this CBA as it is. It is my considered view that considering that the head of public service stepped in to help mediate this matter, as the court ordered the doctors that and the government that they go back to the negotiating table, I think that both parties have got a responsibility to this country, possibly renegotiate the CBA without having ultimatums, without preconditions that would make finding a middle ground difficult. I think that both sides can now come back to the negotiating table in good faith and in the best interest of this country, because remember...
So the doctors must also exhibit good faith in this negotiation?
Yes, yes, both the doctors and the government.
Right.
Because I have seen them, the doctors on their part, having certain preconditions.
Right.
Sometimes what the government is saying is premised on the realities, the fiscal reality that the government finds itself in. So I think that the leadership of KMPDU have got a responsibility to also come to the negotiating table in good faith, without preconditions, and saying that now that we are here, how do we get out of this impasse? And I think I will appeal to my brother Devji Atela that he will have to exercise a lot of leadership in this very moment, together with the head of public service, Honorable Felix Kosgei.
And I mean, James, but then when you look at that, just looking at a statement here from not Davji, but the Deputy National Chair of KMPDU, he says, whatever is happening right now is exploitative labor practices, and that the government cannot afford to mismanage their affairs, that's the doctors' affairs, by legitimizing what he termed as the violation of that CBA. And of course, he termed it as labor abuse as well. Yeah.
I think, while I agree with my colleague Katie, I think when we speak about renegotiation, we must also look at the 2017 CBA with a broader context. Remember, what was happening at this point is that for the first time in Kenya's history, we had a situation where medical interns were done with their studies, but they were not getting posted, right? And so that desire to get posted then created a backlog because government was not doing what they were meant to do. So that was the background within which that was happening. We are now in 2024. The same exact thing is happening 7 years later. So I think even when we invite doctors, for instance, to maybe lower their demands or to be reasonable and to, consider the state that the country is in, it becomes a very hard conversation to have when you also look at the government and you see that there are no efforts that are being made within government to actually engage, for instance, in cost-cutting measures. You have a government that is still bloated. You have a government that is still, in terms of spending, the spending is, up in the sky. So when you look at that context, then it becomes very difficult to tell the doctors, it is you who now must, reduce your demands. So, for instance, even when you talk about the amount of 70,000, I don't know how this figure is being arrived at and why the reduction is happening. And I don't know what steps the government is saying. For instance, yes, we find ourselves in the economic situation we are in today. But even as a sign of goodwill, beyond the salary for interns, remember part of the challenge we've had is that doctors who are specializing, for instance, have not been actually receiving the support they need. And over time, because I've spoken to doctors, and what they've said is, you'd always go specialize, you get your study leave, you come back and you continue working. That has not been happening. So when we only look at it as a question of salaries for the doctors, then we completely miss the point. Because I feel what the doctors are saying is that there's proper labor mismanagement. So that what we need beyond paying these salaries is a complete overhaul of how doctors and nurses and those in the medical field are being managed by government. That issue was there before 2017. It's still there today. So clearly there's something that is not being done. We are treating a symptom, but not really the disease. That is actually the problem. And I believe maybe if God wills it, we'll be sitting here in 2031 having the same discussion, because in 7 years we'll still have the same problem, because no one is really trying to solve the core issues. And that's why I call it a lack of courage, because courage demands that you now actually have to face the bull by the horns, determine what the real issue is, and take the steps that need to be taken. So yes, let the negotiations happen, but it's bigger than salaries. It's a complete overhaul of how doctors are managed. I think over the past maybe 3 or so years, we have seen a lot of doctors taking their own lives. And as a nation, we really need to ask ourselves, what is making medical professionals get to a place where someone feels they need to take their own life? It's because even the working conditions that they are dealing with, it gets to a point where this person feels, I can no longer continue with this, not just the job, but I can no longer continue with my life. So when we talk about Article 41 and the right to fair labor practices, it means work only forms, for instance, a third of your day, isn't it? That third of your day has to be structured in such a way that it does not affect the other 2/3, which might lead to, catastrophic results like people taking their lives. So we need to just have a very broad look and actually determine that we want to solve this once and for all. Remember, in Kenya now, we are understaffed in the medical, in the medical field. We are understaffed. The ratio for doctor to patient, it's ridiculously low in Kenya.
There's a huge gap there.
A very, very huge gap.
All right. Yes. And look, when we come back, we'll be having a discussion on issues of trade unions as well, the labor movement in Kenya, and do they represent the best interest of Kenyans? We've also seen that tiff between the private security sector, specifically on the regulator, as, that tiff between that and the, KOTU. And of course, we'll be having that in just a moment. I want us to head to Uhuru Gardens to have a listen into really what is happening on the ground. And we do have Lofty Matambo and Frida Mwaka on ground. A very good morning to you, Lofty and Frida. I hope you can hear me. And I know it's quite chilly there. I hope you're protecting yourself from the cold. Just give us an idea of how it looks on the ground, and really Kenyans, what are they looking forward to today?
Sadakta Zainab Ismail, ukiwa studioni na wageni, kwa kweli mkichambua hoja za haja, hoja zilizokomaa, zilizokula zikashiba kwa ajili ya mtazamaji wetu wa siku ya leo, nasi tuko ange kabisa. Kikosi kizima cha NTV kiko katika uwanja huu wa Uhuru Gardens katika barabara ya Lang'ata, ambapo sherehe hizi za 59 za leba wangenge wakaita May Day zitakuwa zinafanyika si Kenya pekee, lakini ni katika ulimwengu mzima. Mataifa zaidi ya Kenya, Afrika Mashariki na Afrika, ulimwenguni kote yakijumuika kuweza kuisherehekea siku hii. Siko peke yangu. Kabla kukupa mengi, labda nimpishe mwenzangu pia pacha wangu Frida Mwaka aweze kujitambulisha, tena baadaye tuweze kukujuza ni yapi ambayo yanatarajiwa katika sherehe hizi. Frida.
Na asante sana Lofty Matambo, pacha wangu, tukiwa hapa katika uga huu. Na labda tu mtazamaji nikupatia taswira kamili ya kipi ambacho kinaendelea kujiri hivi sasa. Pacha, tuliweza kufika hapa majira ya asubuhi kabisa, na labda wengi watajiuliza ni kwa nini uga huu bado watu hawajaanza kumiminika. Lakini cha msingi zaidi, kama unavyoona, sisi wenyewe tuko chini ya mwavuli. Hali ya anga vile
chini ya ulinzi.
Si chini ya ulinzi, chini ya mwavuli. Hali ya anga imeweza kuathiri, lakini vile vile watu wanazidi kuminika mmoja kwa mwingine. Na pia vile vile mtazamaji, kama unavyosikia ni kwamba kuna kwaya ama kikosi cha nyimbo ambao kinazidi kuimba Nimeona mwizi mahali. Kuna kwaya ambayo inaimba hivi sasa inazidi kuburudisha watu katika eneo hili, lakini tutakuwa tunatarajia mengi. Tutakuwa tunatarajia Rais William Ruto ambaye ataweza kufika hapa, na pia vyama tofauti ikiwemo vile vyama 45 ambavyo viko chini ya chama cha KOTU.
Bila shaka kama alivyogusia pacha wangu, vyama zaidi ya 45 ambavyo viko chini ya KOTU. Kumbuka kwamba sherehe hizi za 59 mtazamaji zinajiri wakati ambapo Kenya bado haswa vijana wengi wanang'ang'ana kutafuta ajira, kupata kazi, na kwa kweli kwa siku za hivi karibuni Rais William Ruto amesikika akiwahimiza na kuwatia moyo vijana kwamba waweze kuwa mstari wa mbele kutafuta ajira ng'ambo, na mwenyewe akazungumza kwamba amekutana na marais kutoka nchi mbalimbali ambao wanafaa kuwa na ushirikiano wa karibu na taifa hili la Kenya ili kuweza kuwatafutia ajira vijana. Nilikuwa nikiangalia pacha wangu jana hotuba ama ujumbe wa Bi Florence Bore ambaye ndiye waziri wa leba na masuala ya kijamii, anatarajiwa kuwa mmoja wale wageni wa heshima mahali hapa, na alikuwa ametoa ujumbe wake kwa Kenya kwamba ni wakati sasa waweze kujitolea na kuweza kutafuta ajira, akitaja kwamba kama wanavyojua wa Kenya, Frida na mtazamaji, ni kwamba mbali na kahawa, mbali na majani chai, mbali na uwekezaji katika sekta ya utalii, ni kwamba pesa za kigeni zimekuwa kiwango cha juu sana, na waziri Florence alitaja kwamba kwa sasa hivi Kenya inajivunia kwamba inaongoza kwa kupokea pesa za kigeni kupitia Wakenya wanaofanya kazi nje, na akatangaza kwamba kabla kuchukua hatamu za uongozi mwaka mmoja uliopita, Kenya ilikuwa inapokea shilingi bilioni 1.2 hivi pesa za kigeni kuja hapa Kenya, lakini sasa ni shilingi bilioni 6, zimeongezeka mara 6, maradufu mara 3. Kwa hivyo nafikiri itakuwa ni kutajwa sana, na Wakenya wengi watakuwa wanatarajia labda hotuba ya leo ya Rais William Ruto ambayo itakuwa ni hotuba ya pili katika sherehe hizi za leba. Kumbuka alikuwa na moja mwaka jana, na wengi wakatarajia kama atatangaza yapi ya kuweza kumnusuru Mkenya kutoka kwa lindi hili la umaskini, haswa vijana ambao kwa asilimia kati ya 60 na 70 hawana ajira, haswa ajira maalum ambao wamombo wanaita white collar. Sijui pacha wangu wewe kazi yako ni white collar ama ni kola ya rangi gani, lakini vijana wengi wanatamani hata kazi ile ya kijungujiko, kazi ya mkono sahanini, mkono mdomoni, lakini hawapati. Kwa hivyo
jembe mkononi, chakula mdomoni.
Wanatarajia kupata kazi kama hizo. Kwa hivyo utakuwa tunatarajia sana hotuba ya leo. Kumbuka hotuba ya rais leo huwa kilele chake ni kutangazwa kwa mshahara wa chini zaidi. Na utakumbuka pacha wangu na mtazamaji kwamba mwaka jana Rais William Ruto hakutangaza hilo. Na inatarajiwa kwamba sasa hivi labda atatangaza mshahara wa chini zaidi. Ulitangazwa mwaka 2022 Mei, siku kama hii, na rais aliyeondoka, Rais Uhuru Kenyatta, na akatangaza shilingi 15,000 na kama 700 hivi na mbili, ambazo ndio pesa rasmi mtu anayeajiriwa katika ajira rasmi anafaa kulipwa. Kumbuka hiyo ni miji mikuu, mji wa Kisumu, mji wa Mombasa na mji wa Nakuru na Nairobi kunradhi, ambao anaifanya kazi kiwango cha chini alipwe zile. Je, safari hii zitapanda? Maanake gharama maisha imepanda, Frida.
Ni swala nyeti kabisa, na vile vile pia Mkenya wa kawaida anatarajia kusikia hilo pia kutokana na ule mswada wa fedha ambao uliweza kuwakilishwa hapo jana Lofty, na kuna matozo ambayo yaliweza kupendekezwa kutokana na ule mswada wa fedha. Lakini cha msingi zaidi pia katika mazungumzo ya leo tunazungumzia hili swala la hali ya mafuriko Lofty, kwa sababu swala hili la mafuriko pia vile vile linaathiri mfanyakazi wa kawaida. Kwa mfano tuzungumzie mkulima. Kuna wakulima wengi sana ambao wangependa kufika hapa ili kuweza kusikia moja kwa moja kutoka kwa viongozi wetu, je, wamepangiwa nini? Lakini ukiangalia katika barabara zetu huku Nairobi, katika maeneo tofauti, ni kwamba barabara zimekatika, hali ya usafiri na uchukuzi imekuwa ni hali ngumu sana. Ndiposa kuna wafanyakazi wengi sana ambao wangetarajia kufika hapa lakini hawataweza. Swala hili la mafuriko pia vile vile limeweza kuathiri wakulima kwa njia moja hadi nyingine kutokana na kule shambani Lofty. Ulikuwa pale umelima mahindi. Nilitembelea shamba lako nikaona umelima mahindi kidogo, lakini sijui kama bado mahindi yapo ama tayari yashabebwa na maji.
Naona Frida unamwaga mtama mbele ya kuku wengi kabla uive, maanake mtama wenyewe bado uko mashimoni, ndio tunatarajia kwamba utaweza kuchipuka, umee ndio tuweze kumwaga, lakini kwa ukweli ni kwamba walio shambani wanateseka, na hii ni sekta ambayo ndio uti wa mgongo wa uchumi wa Kenya. Zungumzia maeneo ya magharibi mwa Kenya, zungumzia maeneo ya Nyanza ambako kumefurika, mabwawa yameshiba paka yanatapika maji katika maeneo mbalimbali ambapo ndo kilimo kinafaa kuendelea. Maeneo ya Kitale, maeneo ya Kisumu, maeneo ya Vihiga, maeneo ya Budalangi ni maeneo ambayo wengi wanapanda mahindi, wanapanda mpunga, na sasa hivi hakukaliki mashambani. Kwa hivyo ni swala pili ambalo labda litaangaziwa wakati huu ambapo mafuriko yanazidi. Rais William Ruto alipoingia na kuchukua hatamu alitangaza na kuchukua hatua kabambe, manake kumbuka kwamba kilimo ni moja kati ya nguzo zake 6 ambazo alitangaza kwamba atakuwa anaweka pembejeo ikiwemo mbolea kwa bei nafuu, na itakuwa muhimu sana Wakenya waweze kusikia, haswa wakulima, haswa swala hili la mbolea pamoja na mbegu ambazo hazieleweki. Mbolea gushi ambayo sakata imeendelea hadi sasa chini ya waziri wa kilimo Mithika Linturi bado halijaeleweka. Mkulima afanye nini? Mkulima ambaye mbali na kulima kwa ajili ya chakula analima kwa ajili ya kuuza na kupata.
Na wengi wetu tulikuwa tunatoroka mijini tunaenda kule vijijini, lakini sasa vijijini imegeuka ni kama ni sehemu ambayo hatuwezi kutembelea kabisa. Na kutokana na taarifa ambayo ilitolewa jana na wasimamizi wa hali ya anga, waliweza kugusia sasa pwani ndio itakuwa, sijui nitaipatia jina gani, lakini mvua sasa unatarajiwa kunyesha kwa zaidi, haswa kule pani. Kuna bahari kama huku tayari mito zimekatika, baharini itakuwa.
Kwa hivyo swala litakuwa ni je, bahari itafurika, itaweza kufika maeneo ambayo yanafaa kupitika na kufanyika biashara? Manake pia hii mvua ulivyoitaja inaathiri si kilimo peke yake, lakini pia uchukuzi. Manake ukizungumzia leba unazungumzia nguvu kazi za mwananchi Mkenya ambaye anafaa kuingia barabarani asafirishe mizigo, anafaa kuingia barabarani afanye ujenzi, anafaa kuingia barabarani aweze kusafirisha mizigo yake, iwe ni nywele kama ulizonazo pacha wangu, kuingiza pale salon kuweza kusuka.
Unajaribu kusema kwamba hizi nywele nimezivaa, nimezinunua, nywele ni zangu, Mwenyezi Mungu kanibariki nazo.
Si wala sijasema hivyo, lakini kwa kweli unahitaji pia kuingia salon kuweza kurembeshwa. Hizi bidhaa zinasafirishwa kutoka eneo moja hadi jingine. Kwa hivyo kwa kweli itakuwa ni Labor Day ambayo inakuja wakati ambapo kuna changamoto nyingi katika sekta hii ya labor, Frida.
Naam. Pacha wangu ulikuwa umeniuliza swali, ukaniuliza mimi je, niko katika kola gani? Na labda nikuulize wewe kama mfanyakazi, siku kama hii ya leo unaichukulia vipi wewe kama mfanyakazi?
Kwa kweli naichukulia kama siku ambayo tunafaa kujumuika bila kujali ni nani anafanya kazi wapi. Kuna sekta binafsi, kuna sekta jua kali, kuna sekta rasmi, lakini kiukweli katika siku za hivi karibuni Wakenya wengi wamegundua kwamba sasa hivi pesa ziko katika sekta jua kali, ikiwemo hata sekta za mitandao. Na umetaja mswada ambao jana ulikuwa unagusia baadhi ya makato, kwa mfano kama ya mitandaoni, kwamba sasa huenda yakaongezeka. Kumbuka mswada wa fedha mwaka 2023 ulizua kizungumkuti na kivangaito pale bungeni. Tukaona vuta nkuvute kati ya wabunge wa Kenya Kwanza na wa mrengo wa Azimio ambao ni wa upinzani kuzungumza ni vipengee vipi vitamgusa Mkenya, na hizi sekta ambazo umetaja zinaathiriwa sana na baadhi ya sera ambazo huwa zinapitishwa bungeni kutangazwa na rais. Kwa mfano zile sera za moja kwa moja za kuweza kumwathiri Mkenya. Wana bodaboda kwa mfano ni sekta moja muhimu sana, na jana nilikuwa naona kwamba ule uagizaji wa bidhaa haswa pikipiki kutoka ng'ambo ama nchi za nje huenda ukapanda kwa kutoka 15% kama sijakosea hadi 20%, haswa pikipiki ambazo ni za kiwango cha juu cha cc 100,000 na 300. Kwa hivyo masuala ya sekta ni masuala ambayo yanafaa kuangaziwa sana, kwamba ni sekta ipi itamfaa zaidi Mkenya kuliko sekta ingine. Na nafikiri Frida ni vizuri pia kutaja kwamba hatuko peke yetu. Tuko na Brian George. Brian George Otieno ni mwanabiashara na atakuwa anajiunga nasi muda si mrefu kutoka baadhi ya maeneo. Yeye atakuwa anatafuta baadhi ya watu kuwahoji, maanake tunatarajia leo kwamba mbali na ndugu Francis Atoli ambaye ndiye katibu mkuu wa muungano wa vyama vya wafanyikazi, atakuwa ratiba yao ilikuwa inafaa kuanza saa 1 Frida, na walikuwa wanafaa kutoka katika jumba la Solidarity ambako kuna afisi zao, tena waweze kufanya msafara wao
ya kipekee.
Wapige msafara wao hadi barabara ya Lang'ata, waweze kuweka bandi ambayo itakuwa inawaongoza hadi kuingia hapa ndani. Tena baadaye kutakuwa na utumbuizaji na pamoja na wale wakuu wengine wote ambao wako chini yake, akiwemo naibu katibu mkuu, akiwemo mwenyekiti. Tena baadaye tunatarajia hotuba maalum zitakuwa zinatoka kwa mbali na Florence Bore ambaye ndiye waziri wa leba. Tunatarajia pia kupata hotuba kutoka kwa afisa mkuu mtendaji wa muungano wa waajiri ambaye ni Bi Jacqueline Mugo, ambaye pia tunatarajia kupata kwa mmoja wao kabla ya kufika kilele cha hotuba hii. Kwa hivyo mambo tayari yameanza kupamba moto. Angalia nyuma yako Frida, naona kuna kwaya na nimemwona rafiki yako
Wesonga,
Bwana Wesonga, mwalimu Wesonga akiwa anajiandaa na kwaya yake. Kuna kwaya ya NSSF ambayo ni kwaya ya hazina ya malipo ya uzeeni, lakini pia kuna kwaya zinginezo ambazo ziko kule nyuma kuweza kutumbuiza watu. Tunatarajia nini zaidi mbali na kwaya hapa?
Na hata kufikia sasa pia pacha wangu, labda tu nigusie mawili matatu. Nigusie kwamba sasa inaburudisha kuona kwamba Wakenya washaanza kumiminika, kwa sababu nimearifiwa kwamba ilipofika mwendo wa saa 12 kulikuwa na Wakenya hapa zaidi ya 2000, lakini walipofika wakaweza kuzuiwa pale barabarani, wakaambiwa kwamba wangojee kidogo kwa shughuli za itifaki. Lakini kufikia sasa, mtazamaji, kama unavyoona nyuma yangu, ni kwamba Wakenya washaanza kumiminika tayari kusikia hoja mbili tatu kutokana na viongozi kuhusiana na hili swala zima la leba. Na vile vile pia turudi kidogo katika ule mswada wa fedha. Kuna swala ambalo ulikuwa umegusia la wafanyakazi. Na tunajua kwamba Wakenya wanapenda burudani, Wakenya wanapenda sana kujiachilia, kujiburudisha. Ni kuwajuza pia kuna lile swala la ongezeko ya kodi ya vileo na sigara.
Naam. Nafikiri ni swala zuri kabisa la kuweza kumshirikisha Branji. Natabasamu manake Branji George amejiunga nasi na huyu ndo mwana biashara na pengine ana utaalamu katika masuala ya vileo na mtindi. Kwa hivyo pengine atatujuza, lakini mbali na hayo pia ni mtaalamu wa masuala ya ushuru na matozo, makato. Kwa hivyo kuna ule mswada ambao tunatarajia kwamba utajadiliwa. Jana ulikuwa kuwasilishwa bungeni na kujadiliwa, ambao ni wa mwaka 2024, ili labda uweze kutoa mwanga zaidi mbali na ule ambao tayari uleta utata. Na Frida ameuliza swala zuri kabisa. Kuna wafanyakazi ambao wanatarajia kuuza mvinyo na kuna wanywaji pia. Siku hii ya leba inawajumuisha wote. Hii itakuwa na athari gani labda kwa shughuli za kibiashara nchini Kenya?
Kwanza kabisa, kiukweli mimi sio mraibu wala sina utaalamu katika masuala ya mvinyo na mambo kama hayo, ila kwa mujibu wa muktadha wa leo na mazungumzo ya leo na mada ya leo kuhusiana na ile kodi ambayo inatozwa katika vileo, naomba nizungumzie kwa lugha ya Kimombo ili tuweze kuelewana kwa ufasaha. So
ruhusa kaka.
For the very first time we are seeing a return of sin tax, which is basically encompassing alcoholic products, beverages and the like.
Branji, kabla uendelee, ukisema sin tax labda kwa Mswahili tutatafsiri kama ushuru wa dhambi ama matozo ya dhambi.
Haswa hivyo kabisa. Kwa hiyo hali ilivyo ni kwamba mswada huu wa fedha wa 2024 inapania kuleta ama kurudisha ile ushuru wa vileo na mambo kama hayo.
Naam.
Kwa hiyo vile vile when you look at the proposals that are being made currently on that finance bill of 2024, another very key thing that is going to affect so many people is the taxes on basic products like milk, bread, and so much more. Another thing for the people in technology and people who are into tech like myself is that we are going to be seeing an increase in mobile money transactions, an increase in the taxes that are levied on mobile money transactions, airtime and data.
Itakuwa inapanda zaidi ya 15% kama sijakosea.
It will now get to about 20% thereabout. So those are some of the brief highlights. Of course, we are expecting that to be officially communicated and being debated, but that's what we know so far.
Nafahamishwa kwamba kuna wageni studioni na Zainabu Ismail yuko kule. Toka tunazungumza zaidi, manake pia kitu kimoja ambacho labda katika mswada Branji haja kitaja ni kwamba kuna zile bidhaa muhimu sana
kama mkate,
maziwa na hata unga. Alikuwa ametaja Branji.
Labda ni kizungu kidogo kilitupiga chenga.
Kizungu kimenipita.
Hapo kwa sin taxes.
Hapo kwa sin tax, ushuru wa dhambi ule.
Na bila shaka basi Zainabu Ismail pamoja na watazamaji wetu ambao wanatazama kutoka nyumbani. Kwa sasa sisi tuko katika hapa uga wa Uhuru Gardens, kwa tunakuletea mahojiano, kuzungumza na Wakenya vile vile na hata hafla nzima, lakini kwa sasa tunaweka kijiti ili tuweze kumrudishia Zainabu Ismail akiwa studioni aendelee na wageni wetu.
Nashukuru sana Frida Mwaka na Lofty Matambo, kwa kweli mliweza kusema neno moja hapo, itikafi na ikakuwa basi kizungumkuti kidogo kwetu hapa, lakini tunaendelea kutafuta the meaning of that word, which basically means protocol. for the purposes of my guess, but I know, James, you're welcome for that.
Thank you.
Anyway, so they've talked about a number of issues, especially also on the estimates that were, I think, presented yesterday to Parliament. However, I was looking at here at some of the data that we have. We have the ILO rankings, the latest, and also just touching on a number of things there. The cost of living in Kenya has risen, but the minimum wage has not increased in the same pace, reducing the real minimum wage. In 2022, that's when we saw the last minimum wage increased by 12%. That was the first review since 2018. But then again, the cost of the minimum wage basket increased by an average of 22%, with food expenses being the key driver, all right? So then you have the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics data also showing real wages, which is the measure of income after accounting for the cost of goods and services people buy, shrank by 3% in 2022, marking the third straight year of inflation-adjusted pay cuts, all right? So still on ILO data, on working poverty, it's a report called Kenya Economic Report 2023, showed that the country is grappling with a rise in the number of people whose wage and salaries are far below the minimum required to meet the basic needs of food, shelter, and clothing, James. So then this really puts us in a really tight position, especially for those Kenyans who, you know, really have to contend. It's hand to mouth at this point. So then where does the government need to sort of create a cushioning for these Kenyans, or where do we stand from that point?
Yeah. No, I think, I don't think earnings can outperform bad economy. You know, even I see you talking about there's been a 22% increase in the cost of living. I don't think the president is going to come on TV and tell us there's a 22% increase in the minimum wage. You know, that's almost impossible. I think the only way to protect the worker and to ensure that the wages they earn are sufficient to meet their needs is that steps need to be taken to look at the economy. What are some of these high spend areas, and what can the government do? You have fuel. Of course, fuel has been coming down, but the reality is that if you go back to 2022, fuel is not where the fuel today is not the price it was even at that time. There's been an increase. Of course, we've seen a drop coming. As you've spoken about the cost of food, steps have to be taken to ensure that basic commodities are reduced in price, because it will be very hard to find that wages meet the cost of living. It's almost impossible. And so what we are seeing is that a lot of workers, the wages cannot stretch. And this, I guess, also has contributed to the taking up of some of these loans. Because today you'll find, I represent employers sometimes, and you'll find employers will talk to you and tell you, I have an employee here who has SACCO loans that they can never repay. You know, they have mobile loans they can never repay, and they are still applying for more. So it's a real crisis. Workers are trying to find as many sources of income as possible, but it's also ending up plunging them into more and more debt. So the only way to deal with that properly is that the government has to, the economic transformation the government says we are on, I think we need to move a bit faster than we are, so that that cost of living comes down and the worker can now be able to breathe a little bit.
But even looking at the current situation, I mean, first of all, the minimum wage is quite low, cannot keep up with that pace. And then you have deductions that we are witnessing, pay as you earn. We have SHIF, we have, you know, National Security, Social Security Fund, all these things. They're really
and
continuing.
The housing levy. Don't forget the housing levy. Yeah.
I mean, this continues to burden that paycheck of the Kenyan worker. Where do we turn to?
That's the question I think every worker is asking.
Right.
Where do we turn to? Because, of course, the government has set its targets on what it wants in terms of revenue. Because, unfortunately, we are saddled with very huge debt. We cannot even account for where that money has gone. It always feels like Kenya is getting debt to pay off debt. We are not really getting money for development or to induce, you know, economic development. So the worker today, I think he finds himself between a rock and a hard place.
Right.
Yeah, and SHIF is here. Of course, the idea that has been presented is that it's supposed to be revolutionary, okay, but it's still eating into that paycheck. The housing levy is here, it's still eating into that paycheck. The Finance Act 2024 is coming, and I can assure you there will be something more to come and take. So the government is taking and taking and taking, and I think they also need to give in equal measure. It's only fair.
Kidi, too many taxes, levies imposed on Kenyans. Where does that leave the Kenyan worker today?
Before I get into the too many levies, I want to respond to the question of debt distress, both as a governance issue. You realize that today we've got governments, debt distress at government level or at sovereign level, debt distress at household level, and debt distress at individual level. So that all these layers of debt are, taking away monies that ordinarily would have been invested in improving lives. And so the question is, in 2024, as we commemorate the Labor Day, what is it that we can do to alleviate debt distress? If we cannot alleviate it at individual and at household level, then what is government doing intelligently and creatively to ensure that we sort out the question of debt distress, sovereign debt distress? Because then, that way, we are going to ensure that we've got the fiscal headroom for government to be able to invest in the critical sectors of the economy that can spur economic growth. Because when the economy is underperforming, then you realize that the questions we are talking about of extra levies will be with us to stay. Because, again, there is what we call the cost of running government. The cost of running government, especially where we have a bloated civil service, like we do in Kenya, I think that government must meet the cost of running that government. And that money usually must come from the people. So that when we are unable to spur economic growth, then still Kenyans for a very long time will have to cry about government raiding their payslips. And that takes me to the question of the suggestion by the Minister for Public Service, that then we put the civil servants on contract. I think that idea still needs proper rethinking, because a civil service is important in any country. It is actually what the state is anchored on. And we need to have a civil service that is merit-based, that enjoys technical competence, and that is also impersonal. When you introduce the question of contract in the civil service, what it means is that we are not going to have institutional memory, because people will be coming and leaving. And then when we have our civil service broken, then I think it will be the last straw on the back of this camel we call Kenya that we are saying has been doing badly. I think in the area of civil service, putting civil servants on contract is something that people of Kenya must reject. Or unless Honorable Moses Kuria convinces us more intelligently than what he has attempted to do, why we should go we should put civil servants on contract.
But I mean, his whole idea is pinned on the spiraling wage bill in the country, that perhaps if we're able to transition from pensionable to permanent and pensionable to contract, then the country is going to find itself in a better physical space than where it is.
Yes, that is why I've said that I don't think he has thought about it more intelligently. Because I want us to look at countries that have had problems similar to what Kenya is grappling with. In 2009, 2010, 2011, Greece and Italy were going through what was called the European financial crisis. And one thing that was synonymous in Italy and in Greece is that they had a big civil service that, for years they had used to perpetrate politics of patronage. So that it means the person who is in power brings his own people, and you see when he leaves power, the people he had brought into government, some of them incompetent, do not get retrenched, do not get processed out, they remain in service. So over time, they had a big wage bill that they did not know what to do with. But then remember that by pre-2010, most of the European Union had gone through economic boom. So the economic boom of the early 2000s had cushioned this evil that Italy and Greece had found themselves in. again, to contradistinct with Kenya, remember that the moment President Moi left office, part of the grievance, remember there was a political grievance that the Rift Valley had with President Moi Kibaki, that President Kibaki had removed their people from service. The thing is, when President Kibaki removed, again, I'm using this very cautiously, that whenever he removed a Kalenjin, he replaced him with someone from his backyard, and that person also brought his person. So what happened is that we used the civil service to perpetuate the politics of patronage. Then when President Kibaki left, President Uhuru came, and that continued. That is why you realize that critical sectors of the economy under President Kibaki and under President Uhuru could only be under certain people. It also meant that people, as those people were coming in, they were coming in with their people. And what that has done is that we have perpetuated the politics of patronage in the civil service. Remember when Raila Odinga was still Prime Minister, one of the constant things he used to say that let us detribalize the civil service and let us depoliticize the security agencies. Those are problems that we still have. So I think that instead of Moses Kuria saying that we need to put civil servants on contract, let's agree that we have committed a sin in regards to management of our public service. Let us again figure out, number one, how do we retain competence? How do we retain institutional memory? How do we ensure that we only get people into the civil service based on merit? How do we ensure that our civil service is impersonal so that you don't have people in the civil service because they know Kidimwaga, who is, say, a minister in this government? Thank you.
All right. And James, I know you want to add on to that, but just to give you some context here, so the public service currently employs 960,425 workers. And this, by the way, they're expected to gobble up about 1.17 trillion in salaries and allowances in the year ending June 2024. Last year, the public sector wage bill of 1.1 trillion was 46.6% of the 2.36 trillion taxes collected by KRA, which was higher than the recommended 35% of taxes. What do you think of those statements by the Cabinet Secretary? And does it intend to cure the issue of the wage bill in the country?
Well, I think in 2024, all decisions that are made need to be backed by data. I think when I've listened to the Honorable Minister, I have not had the data that is backing this decision making, all right? Now, from a purely legal point of view, to change a contract from P&P to a fixed term, already there's a process that needs to be undertaken for that. And I think that's what my colleague is talking about, whether it has been well thought out. Because there is a proper claim there for unfair labor practice. Now, remember as well that the permanent nature of a civil servant's job also allows them to access certain benefits. Let us think about the banks. What's going to happen to the banks? I think we know a lot of our civil servants have taken a lot of facilities with banks, and those facilities are hinged on the power of that payslip that they receive. It's going to have an effect all over the economy. It's going to be felt all over the country. So I do not see whether that decision has been well thought out. Perhaps we need to get more data from him. Perhaps we need to know how that is going to happen. But this also takes me to my original point about a lack of courage. Remember what we are saying. Yes, the public wage is huge. But as my colleague here said, it's also the reality that we have a lot of people in public service perhaps who are underperforming, right? We have a lot of people who are not doing what they ought to be doing. We have a lot of people who've got into these positions because of political patronage. Courage demands that at a management level, decisions are taken that ensure that we are able to weed out people who do not want to serve the public, that we're able to look at people who are not qualified for the positions they hold and we replace them with people who are qualified. No one is actually taking that step. The judiciary, I think, has tried to even come up with the question of performance contracting, where you have to be held against certain standards. When we've seen the interviews for the High Court applicants, High Court judge applicants, you'll realize that all the magistrates, the first thing they are told is, here is your performance scorecard. We need to actually have proper management. And management is management of your performance. These are the targets we have set. These are the targets you have not met. How do we deal with that? But secondly as well, recently the KRA was, the High Court in Busia found that the KRA had awarded the positions for the revenue assistants. I think 56% had gone to 2 tribes. When you look at how the defense of KRA in court, even the court could not agree with that defense that these are the only people who are qualified. Because remember, the Constitution, when it comes to public service, the Constitution envisions that opportunities are given to every single Kenyan. Now, population, of course, is a factor. And this is something that the court considered. But you cannot have, for instance, 2 communities taking up 56% of the positions that are available. And in one instance, you find, I think there was an allegation in the suit in court that the area where one of the members of the board at KRA came from, I think they got almost like 40 slots. There was no basis for that. And even what the High Court says in that matter is, when it comes to appointment of Kenyans and a policy on how you then distribute the appointments tribally, KRA did not have such a policy. You can imagine KRA is an organization that you'd expect would have a policy in place that says, when it comes to hiring Kenyans, this is how we are going to carry out the distribution. So it boils down to an issue of management. Indeed, we have a huge workforce. And it's for the reasons you have said. Because every time government has come up with something, it has been an opportunity then to reward friends, to reward loyalists, okay? You come with your 5 people. Another one comes with their 10. Now we have documents, you know, certificates, school certificates are now being verified. And the results are shocking.
Yes.
You have people who have never stepped into a university, but who are holding senior positions. I think we had one of our agencies in public works, where a senior management says he has a degree in engineering. He has never stepped into an engineering school. That person has earned a wage over time. Management is the problem, because with proper management, such matters would have been discovered and resolved at that time. So yes, we need to reduce the wage. We need to reduce the wage bill. We need to be within the limits that have been set. But I feel that this will be an incremental journey. But you also realize that while we are still complaining about it, the same thing is still happening. So that's it's lack of courage, as I'm saying. Because if truly we are sure that what we want to do as a government is to reduce the wage bill, is to ensure that we do not have a bloated workforce, then we cannot continue to do the same things over and over again. But the reality is this. You've had, when we've spoken about shareholders, you know what that language tells you is, when the cake is being cut, some people will eat the cake and others will eat the crumbs. We are still perpetuating the same attitude towards public service. And that's why this is a problem I think we are going to struggle with for a long time. Yes.
And I mean, even just yesterday, we had public sector unions who now have declared the intention to hold demonstrations every Tuesday in solidarity with the doctors and to protest against what they term and see as the government's direct aggression against the labor sector. Now, this adds to concerns about labor rights and health policy. These unions complaining that the government has failed to honor mutually signed CBAs leading to industrial actions. For example, the doctors one. But what I do know is that they are saying, if I can get that, I'm trying to get that statement. So this was issued yesterday, saying that trade unions are formed by workers to protect their rights and interests in the workplace. And they've criticized the Public Service Cabinet Secretary Moses Kuria's remarks about changing what we've talked about, the terms of employment of public service workers from permanent to contractual, threatening trade union leaders and high taxation. So then, I mean, Kidi, these are remarks that are coming from a cabinet secretary. And then if you do have public sector unions who decide, look, every Tuesday we're going to the streets together with the doctors to demand for, you know, better working conditions and all these things that they're talking about, it's like crippling the government at this point.
Well, I think that, again, it takes me back to what I said earlier, that people in positions of responsibility must be alive to, the enormous responsibility that is resting on their shoulders. Part of that responsibility is a question of enhancing social trust. Sorry. When the social trust is frayed, or what in other jurisdictions you'd call the social contract, whenever it is frayed, then trust me that the voice of the people will always trump, will always prevail over the voice of the governor or over the voice of those in positions of power. So it is incumbent upon those in positions of responsibility to be more gracious and more intelligent and more tactful as they engage with the people.
Yeah.
It is incumbent again on the said cabinet secretary to ensure that as he engages these other people, remember the workers' unions, he must remember that industrial relations are anchored in the law. Because they are anchored in the law and their basic rights, it is incumbent upon them to ensure that we find a way out to ensure that government can still able to discharge its mandate to the people while finding ways of managing the concerns that are being raised by the labor unions. Again, remember that traditionally, labor unions have been powerful political voices. We've got entire political parties that have been basis for labor unions. You go to parties like the Labour Party of the UK. It was first a political party that came up because of the workers in Manchester. You go to parties like the Democratic Party in the US. It was first a party that came together because of the workers. I think that because sometimes in Kenya we've not had these labor organizations, labor unions, having a political party that they properly identify with. Ndugu Francis has said that kazi ya kotu ni kufanya kazi na serikali inayofanya kazi, which I think is a decision premised on pragmatism in his understanding, that he thinks that when he works jointly with the government of the day, it helps his constituency to get concessions from government. But again, the question now will be that are the Kenyan workers happy that they've worked with subsequent governments from the year 2001 when Ndugatweli came to Kotu to date? What can they show for it? Is there something to smile about? If there is nothing to smile about, then it is incumbent upon the workers today to reconsider their stance and figure out what is the best way forward for them. Thank you.
And I mean, looking at the labor movement in Kenya, James, from where you stand as a lawyer, do you think they've served its purpose? Do you think they've really worked towards upholding the interest of the people they represent?
I think the performance has been underwhelming, largely, especially at the national level, where one would expect that we would see more robust engagement. I think I can try to remember the history I learned. Tom Mboya actually came into the scene when we were fighting for independence as a person who was fighting for workers' rights. So even at the point of independence, we had labor unions that were organized and were actually ensuring that the voice of the worker is heard. Has that been the case over the previous 2 or 3 decades? I don't think so. I think there has been perhaps a failure or an underperformance by unions in that way. However, I also point out because of the employment work we do, we've also found that at the ground level where you have these smaller unions, they are actually doing a terrific job in advocating for their members. So in those small spaces, yes. At this big national level, perhaps they need to be re-energized. They need to have what the people at the unions at the lower level have. Yes.
And we've seen some sort of pushback against the Kotu Secretary General Francis Atwoli. Now, even as he invited the president to attend the Labor Day celebrations at Uhuru Gardens, there was another trade union known as the Trade Unions Congress of Kenya. It's little known, that is also organizing its celebrations at KICC. So that will be interesting to see. I want us to just turn back to Lofty Matambo, who's now joining us live. If you can just get